Sophie Rickard.
Hello there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the Radical Book Fair. My name is Heather Palmer. I'm a comics writer and editor, and today I'm here with Sophie Rickard, a writer of The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists and No Surrender. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really sorry that my sister Scarlett's not with us. She's got COVID, so she's confined to home. So I do the words and she does the pictures, but you can ask me about the pictures and I'll make something up.
We will. We'll ask challenging questions about the pictures specifically for this reason.
Yeah.
So please join me in welcoming Sophie. Do you think you could tell us a little bit about No Surrender to start us off?
Yes. No Surrender was written in about 1910, 1911 by Constance Maud, who was an active suffragette. And it was written kind of as a recruiting tool. So it's a novel, it's a made-up story, but it's full of references to things that really happened, just not necessarily in the order that they happened. It's been revered in the 100 or so years since as a really accurate social record of what it was like to be a suffragette and the kinds of things that went on. And I'm hoping that what we've done with the graphic novel is to bring it to a new audience. The story is good. Like, it's not what it's most famous for, but it's a good story. Lots of exciting things happen. But the other thing that is so great about it is that it really shows you kind of both sides. So it's a very similar vibe to The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist. So The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist was written by a painter and decorator in a similar era about what it's like to be working class. And No Surrender is written by a suffragette about what it was like to be a suffragette. So you hear from the people arguing against them as well as from the suffragettes themselves, which helps you understand the context that they were protesting in.
Yeah, and I would say you have taken a book that's of its time and made a really dynamic adaptation that is really engaging and character-driven for the reader. And part of that, obviously, is the nature of collaboration. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the roles that you and Scarlett take in creating an adaptation.
Yes, so it's very clear to us who does what. It's very easy for us to decide who takes responsibility for which bit. And I have to say, for both of these and the next one, Scarlett comes up with an obscure book and asks me to read it and says, "What do you think?" And then it's my job to essentially turn it into a script, a little bit like a film script. So I'm not really prescriptive about what to draw. I do the sort of filleting job that adaptation can be. So it's more about what to leave out and to which bits have modern relevance. And then when we have a script, we work on that together to do a storyboard where Scarlett roughs it out really quickly just on A4 paper and a pencil. And, you know, there's like stick figures in boxes and stuff. And we work out who's going to say what. Because we do have a rule that the only writing in the books is dialogue. So we don't, what we think of it as cheating. If you have like meanwhile or 100 years later or whatever, it all has to be, that's what the pictures are for. Mm-hmm. So, and then from that storyboard, Scarlett decides what goes where on each page, and she tends to draw a page and send it to me, and we talk about it, and then she draws the next one. But she does the sketching out, the drawing, the inking, the colouring, and the lettering all at once.
That is amazing. That is a lot of work.
We didn't know that was unusual until after we made The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist. We didn't really understand how many people are usually involved in making a comic.
Yeah, you might want another 10 or so involved.
Yeah,
You've got it covered.
Yeah.
Scarlett's on top of that.
Yeah, she's doing all the work.
I did really, that was one of the things I really enjoyed about the book, was that you didn't, I think captions in comics are kind of, pastiche a little bit at the moment. They're kind of out of fashion. But in a book like this, you see a lot of reliance on that to tell that time has moved on, but instead you're showing it in the art, like, a broken arm is healed, a black eye has arrived. There's like loads of sort of physical indicators that time has passed instead.
And the weather.
And the weather.
Yeah. So I think both books the originals are on the wordy side because they're Edwardian and we're not used to that. But the whole point of both of them is to show, not tell. So they're novelizations, dramatizations of an argument. And so it would kind of undermine that to then not to tell rather than show. So yeah, and the pictures can do things much more subtly than words can. You know, so you can tell how wealthy a person is by the kind of clothes that they wear and what their house looks like, and you can tell whether it's cold outside by whether they've got a coat on or not, and you don't need to spell it out then.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you're touching on the clothing, which I really enjoyed, as I love historical fashion. Like, I really enjoy watching people recreate it, and I really found that was something that felt so accurate in the book, but also it was so colourful and varied, and you had like picked up those parts that are so often forgotten about. That the past was colourful. It's just that we happen to have black and white records of it.
Yes, I think there's a richness in No Surrender, partly because it's got a lot of women in it, but also because there are more wealthy people in it than in The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist. The colour in The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist is much sort of more muted, because most of the time we're looking at people having a bit of a grey time. Whereas in No Surrender, it was an explosion of these women making a real big impact. But Scarlett's attention to detail with clothes really shows. Like, you can tell by looking at the pictures that she really loves detail. I hasten to say that I never ever ask her to put patterned wallpaper in a room or any of those things that the book's full of. She does that to herself.
Wow.
Like, I don't make that happen.
Yeah, and there's such, you say, there is such a richness in the textures of the fabric.
Yeah, so she'll decide, okay, so this character wears a dress with 100 buttons on it and is going to appear 7 times on that page. I'm like, okay.
And also the extravagant hats and like just these really amazing period details.
So we spend a bit of time at the beginning deciding who's going to look like what and some sort of basic sort of rules, because one of the things in comics that's important to get right, especially when you've got a big cast, is that you definitely know who everybody is and that they don't look too like each other. And so people will have a certain sort of colorway, and we usually make sure that at least one of the people is a redhead, because that helps. And that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so we have decided that kind of thing a little bit at the beginning, but often, so for instance, there's a scene in No Surrender that takes place at a dinner party with lots of posh people having a really posh time, and she spent ages on what they were going to wear, what the dinner service was going to look like, the cutlery, the glassware, and then the meal. Like, we see, it's so subtle, like, you wouldn't know if I hadn't told you, but they go through whatever it is, 7 or 8 courses, and they're all historically accurate, outrageous menus that she found and then decided to serve them.
And they look delicious.
They look a lot more delicious than some of the recipes she showed me.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I can imagine. And touching on these sort of class separations, there is a lot of that, and then there's also these really stark moments where the independence and sort of individuality of the main characters is stripped away when they're imprisoned, and they are then dressed in grey. And can you talk a little bit about those moments and how it felt to create those?
One of the strengths of this book is that it takes women from all kinds of different walks of life and demonstrates to you why the cause was relevant to them and what the day-to-day impact of having no civil rights was like for all of these different women. So for Jenny, who works in the mill, it's a very real case of economic survival, and her neighbour, who is a widow with children, has to go to work, those kind of things. And then for some of the more wealthy people, it's to do with whether they're going to inherit, whether they have control over their own lives, all kinds of different situations. But like you say, once they've done the crime and they're doing the time, they're all in the same situation, and some of them are a lot better suited to it than others. So in the scenes when they're in prison, the working women tend to cope a little bit better with having to keep their own cells tidy and things like that. Yeah. But like you say, at the end of the day, it really brings it all down to the humanity, and that's what the subject of the book is about. It's about this sort of radical concept that women are human beings and that they should be treated like the other human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some amazing moments where the protesters are showing so much empathy towards the people that are standing in their way, that are trying to take their rights, that are complicit in an incredibly kind of dangerous system. But they seem to have quite a lot of pity. They're very kind to policemen, particularly. You show policemen as quite brutal, but the characters themselves are sort of like, well, you're doing your job, and so long as you're obeying the orders of the state, then we're not angry at you personally.
There's a line that I really enjoy in the book where Jenny says, "Oh, we don't blame those policemen. They don't know any better." So they're like, Constance Maud had some sympathy for the idea that everybody could be converted. And so you don't persuade somebody of your argument by telling them how wrong they are first. You've got to find another way. And in the book, Jenny particularly goes about it like that. And with the police and with other people in authority, she appeals to their reason as opposed to objecting to their place in the system. Because if they were going to bring about change, they need to persuade people with power rather than just tell them off for having the power. Mm-hmm. So it's complex because I think I did tone down a little bit of that. Constance Maud wrote the book in a way that sort of said, oh no, we never hurt anybody. So to be fair, the WSPU, which was the Pankhursts and that side of the suffragettes, were really quite militant in the sense that it was run like an army. The Women's Freedom League, who Constance Maud was part of, was a more pacifist end of the scale, and they were more about the stunts that got the publicity. And that is where my personal sympathies lie, but it isn't actually what brought change.
Yeah, and you sort of signpost that the women who have been very peaceful, very empathetic, have started to realise that there is going to be no change that way, or that they have laid the groundwork perhaps for change, but it won't be pushed through until there's more like dramatic action.
I think there are lines in it that are so familiar to what's happening right now with well, it's all very well them having this cause, but if they go around upsetting everybody and breaking things, that's not how to get what you want. And the women are saying, well, we've been doing petitions and we've been writing letters and nothing happens, so we've got to do something different. And I don't think that's ever going to change.
Yeah, and there are some really incredible moments where your protagonists look out of the panel at the reader and sort of challenge the reader quite openly, I think, and take that pause to say, this is from 1911, but think about how this, looks to you right now.
It was remarkable that when we first started work on No Surrender, we were saying to the publisher, this is relevant because of Black Lives Matter and the Colston statue that went in the drink and environmental protests, but not like we've had in the last few weeks. And in the time it's taken us to draw it, we've got America voting on lines of whether women should have rights over what happens inside their bodies or not. And we've got really, really creative civil disobedience coming from Just Stop Oil, who at the time I hadn't heard of when we started this book. They are live subjects. It's a relevant story. But what's interesting about suffragettes is that of all the terrorists, they have a lot of sympathy in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
People don't tend to think of them as terrorists, but they were violent for political ends.
That's right, and there was so much kind of washing of those records and sort of make it look like, oh no, we that person wasn't involved with us, with the official story. It's really, really interesting that it's been kind of sanitized almost.
Well, I think there's a safe distance, and it would be quite hard to find people who would argue that women shouldn't have the vote now. Mm-hmm. And then that sanitizes the methods.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's so applicable to what's in the news every day.
It really is. And was that what you were writing it with in mind all the time, or were you focused on the time of 1911 and what the subject matter was, or were you constantly thinking about these sort of attacks on human rights now?
And in the process, the point of adapting it for now is to help people see what's relevant now, I think.
Yeah.
So yes, it is very much in my mind when I'm working on the script. Like, a lot of the things that don't get included are the things that are not, that people are not going to identify with now. So there are historical references in the original that I didn't understand. I'd have to look up what they meant and then think, oh, I'll leave that out. So that's why the graphic novels of both books feel like a distillation of the arguments, because they're the bits that are most relevant to us now, I think.
Yeah, and I noticed that when we're focusing on speeches, and there are some really powerful speeches in this, and they're really passionate, and you translate them so well to the panel. And I was wondering if that's, are those speeches directly taken from Maud's book, or how have you chosen what makes it in and what doesn't? Because obviously a long speech in graphic format is a difficult one, especially if your artist might not want to cover all their art.
And our main concern at all points is whether this is going to be fun to read. Like, we have a healthy respect for our readers' time and attention, so it's supposed to be an enjoyable thing to spend time with. So you don't want to make it like school.
Yeah.
The answer to your question is, when we first did Ragged Trouser Philanthropist, our original idea was to keep Tressel's dialogue.
Oh.
That was absolutely never going to happen. I'm much better at it now. So yes, it starts with the speech that Constance Maud wrote for Jenny to say in this moment, but it gets almost completely rewritten. But it's like making concentrated squash fruit juice. Like, I'm trying to get what she means and some of the authentic language from the time, but not so much that makes it feel like you're reading a different language. So
Yeah.
I do talk them out loud quite a lot.
Oh, and you can really tell as well, because the dialogue is so great and the accents are so consistent, which is such a challenge to do.
That is great to hear. The accents is an interesting one, because in both original source materials, they've got quite patronising, on the offensive side, working class voices. Dialects written in a way, you can do too much of that. And so we sort of tidy that off a bit.
That's really interesting.
But yeah, people have very clear, distinct voices in our minds when we're making it. And so yes, it's good that that comes across. You can sort of tell who's talking by the way they say things.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I also would like to ask, you talk a little bit, or in terms of like the class difference, who's in charge, there are moments where the sort of medical infrastructure is quite complicit in the violence towards women. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you portrayed that, and a little bit about that.
The way that it was written in the original was really well done, and it's very shocking, and it is very clearly the consequence of their actions. So they be civilly disobedient, they continue to do that in prison, and then what happens is this force feeding. But even before we see the force feeding moment, we have a moment when a doctor is saying things like, if she carries on being disobedient, I'll just pull all her teeth out. That'll stop her complaining.
That was terrifying.
Yeah, the idea that a medical professional would use a medical procedure as some sort of punishment or control is terrifying. But it's not that long ago.
No, it's really not.
And the patriarchy and the medical profession and women's experience of healthcare is a live issue.
It is, yeah. And as well, like how trans people are treated as well in medical. That's what it highlighted for me.
Yeah.
How, medical, how the medical infrastructure treats them as well now today, and specifically in terms of like conversion therapy and stuff.
The medicalisation of being human is something that is an issue, and the idea of how people can be diagnosed with being themselves is a worry. And I think that there is lots of things that in 100 years' time, like one of the lines in the book is Jenny says, in the future, your grandchildren will look back at how women were treated now and be horrified. And that got to stay in there because I wanted people to imagine what their grandchildren will look back at now and be horrified about.
Yeah, and it's really effective to see that as well. All those, the individual gazes of young people looking at their elders and us looking back into the past, that you really achieve that, I think.
Yeah, and one of the great things about making things in this comic format is that we do get younger readers, that we've brought younger people to both of these stories that wouldn't otherwise have come across them, and that's very, very satisfying.
Yeah, and to bring like you know, a book that might have been sidelined back into the forefront into a really accessible format is really special. It's like a really amazing thing to bring to the world.
It's very satisfying because the books themselves are authentic parts of their era. And I hope that that's been brought over into the new format. So yes, it's important that they're fun to be with. It's important that they're easy to access, but they still have that authenticity of being made by somebody who was there at the time, rather than being about them. It's their own story.
Yeah, and it really draws the reader in, like I say, with those moments where they look out at the panel and look at us and bring us into that world, and all those details come together to make a really absorbing moment that you feel that you are in that drawing room or in the dining room having jelly of all many varieties.
And those moments when they sort of look right out is a kind of cheating thing, because when you make a rule that all of your words have to be dialogue, whenever someone spends time by themselves, you've got two options. They talk to a cat or they talk to themselves. And we've used both.
Yeah. You haven't got onto volleyball with their handprint yet.
Yeah, and it's a lot of, when you're taking a prose novel into a comic format, you've got a lot of a prose novel goes on inside people's heads. So you've got to have them vocalize it or draw them having thoughts, which is something that I can, in the scripts, I don't spend any time worrying about what it's possible to draw and what it's not possible to draw.
Yeah.
I just write what I want.
Wow.
And
dangerous.
Scarlett never complains. So the opening pages of the book, the opening of the script says 300 to 500 women are weaving in the weaving shed.
What a way to start.
And
there are many artists who would have just closed the Word document there and then and just been like, I know she's my sister, but
I'm not sure there are 300 to 500 in what she drew, but it definitely feels like
it
there
really
is.
does,
and
yeah.
I think that I so take it for granted, because we work in a world that's full of horses, which are famously a problem. Bicycles are another thing that people don't like drawing. But the crowd scenes in No Surrender, I mean, the final chapter is essentially a crowd.
Yeah.
It's the biggest demonstration that London have ever seen of the suffragettes. So it's hundreds of thousands of people, and she's drawn them all.
Yeah, and they're all individual.
Oh, yeah, they all have their own faces and their own fashion and their life, and you can tell that they are humans. And there are sort of Easter eggs in there for people who are familiar with the era and the suffragettes and things. There are some real people scattered in there.
That's very exciting. I'm going to have to go back now.
Not
My
loads,
magnifying
but
glass.
some. Yeah.
For me, it was the cycling trousers, the like skirt that has all the buttons
Yeah,
down
yeah,
both sides. And I was
yeah.
like, oh my goodness. And that is like a favourite moment for me, to see those in action.
Yes. And Scarlett there's really, really good footage on the BFI website that you can get easily of that actual day in history. And so we did use some of that. So the banners and things most of them are like historically accurate, and then some we've just thrown in for fun.
Quite right.
Yeah.
You've got to have fun. And there are moments, talking of fun, there are moments of like quite performative allyship in the books, and where people, and also moments where people who should be the ally to your protagonists turn around. There's a really painful moment where some women have been arrested for a different crime, and they would be so benefited by suffrage, but they're really dismissive of the women that are there because they've been protesting. Do you think that kind of atmosphere is something that we still face now?
Definitely. I think that the people who put soup on the sunflowers, for example, got a lot of stick on social media for being posh.
Yes.
And I find that a little bit confusing, because if the teenagers with all of the privilege are not going to take the risks of getting arrested to try and stop the entire planet melting, like, who do we want to do it?
Yeah.
Maybe the poor teenagers are supposed to do it.
They're meant to be doing all the work, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Apparently.
Maybe.
Yeah, that was a really interesting moment, and they're so young as well. Your protagonists and also
Yes.
protesters now, and it's such a hard responsibility that is put on younger generations.
The main characters in No Surrender are young, but also every kind of person was involved. There were men, there were older women, there were women in it who've been part of the battle since before women could own their own property. And they were saying, when I was young, you couldn't have property. And the current protagonist, the young people, are saying, I can't even imagine living like that. And that's interesting from our point of view as well, looking back on how much has happened in such a short time. And I think that's something that maybe we don't, like today, the teenagers now don't know, for example, what it was like to be gay in the 80s. Like, they have a sort of sketchy concept of Section 28, for example. And so it's very fast, the turnover, and being able to show the material impact of not having civil rights is helpful, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm just thinking of, like, a lost generation as well that we face with the AIDS crisis as well, that we don't have those direct links. And that's why these kind of written stories are so important now to keep and to update as well.
And they're historical novels. They're set in an Edwardian era, but they are metaphors for all kinds of things that still happen now. There were parts in No Surrender where people are talking about how terrible the impact has been within families, where the families have been on different sides, and that reminded me of Brexit.
Yes, and the indie referendum up
Yes,
here.
yes,
Painful.
absolutely.
Disinherited.
Yeah. So Constance Maud dedicated the original novel to a woman called Charlotte Despard, who was one of the founders of the Vote magazine, which was a Women's Freedom League publication. And Charlotte Despard's brother was like the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. So he was running Ireland for the British, and she was very much not on that side.
Right.
So I think some of those parts where she was referring to those arguments were making reference to Charlotte Despard's actual life.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm going to hand over to the audience in a moment. We've got some questions, hopefully from online, and hopefully we have some live here as well. But before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, like we've mentioned, there are moments where the protagonist is speaking to the reader, and I wondered, what is the key thing you wanted for the reader to take away, the modern reader to take away from this novel? It's a hard question, sorry.
No, it's a good one. It's a good question. I think the first thing is I would like someone who's just read it to think, oh, that was good. I enjoyed that. That's my first responsibility. But if there's a message that would change the way people feel, is to do with applying what you've just learnt to what's in front of you right now. And that's the same with both books. With The Ragged Trousers Philanthropist, it helps people to look at the structures surrounding you in a different light. And I hope that No Surrender does as well, for those situations where being lawful and something being just and not necessarily the same thing. And I think it's not unreasonable in the current international climate to help people to be aware that sometimes there are bad laws, and that it's everybody's job to do something about that.
Yep, and that is a really powerful message that I think comes loud and clear out of No Surrender.
Good, thank you.
Do we have any questions in the audience? In the room? I have a roving mic for you. Okay, yeah, Lindsay in the front row there.
We do have an online question, which we can start off with, but does anybody here have a question? Yes. I think I can make this to you.
Yeah, this is where we test how long the cables are.
So you talked about being sort of selective about which elements you included. What would you say was the most challenging kind of moment to adapt from the novel?
No Surrender was written in quite a visual way, which was really helpful. So it wasn't nearly as difficult as adapting The Ragged Trouser Philanthropists. The hardest thing to get on the page into a graphic novel is when it's people thinking things but not doing things. And so there are things that get left out just because it's not possible to show. I think one of the things we've done in No Surrender that has worked, I hope, is showing people telling stories of things that have happened before, and then we've chosen to illustrate the thing that was happening before. So either in people's imagination or as an abstract concept, but we've put them in different shaped panels. We've had the colours are slightly different, so you can tell whether you're looking at the past or right now. And that was quite challenging. It was a really interesting challenge to make the most of the form, really. People tend to, bookshops particularly, think of graphic novels as a genre, but it's not a genre, it's a medium. And making the most of the medium means using the pictures to do the work for you, which in my case means using my sister to do the work for me.
The ideal scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love those moments where the panel completely changes shape and we're so absorbed into the past so quickly.
And then there's
Amazing.
one where somebody's telling a story that has a story inside it, and we went into black and white.
Yes, that was brilliant.
It's like a cheat code. Using
Yeah.
things from film as those kind of codes is really helpful.
Yeah. And it's also like really of that time to write sort of those bracket narratives where you're going through somebody else's...
like Mary Shelley going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that reference. Do we have one from online? A question from online?
We do. Kelly says, loved this chat and all these insights. It's so refreshing to see graphic novels beyond just superheroes. I wondered if both of you could tell us about what excites you in the genre just now, or the bits of it you'd like to see change.
Okay, so the question was about how it's nice to see graphic novels that are not superheroes. So my first thought is they are superheroes. They're just not wearing, they probably are wearing tights. They're not wearing capes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, some of them are wearing capes.
There were some capes.
Yeah, there are some capes
Some
in there.
fashion capes.
Just different kinds of capes. So, yeah, a lot of the comics world is men in tights and manga and lots of things that British people tend to think are for children. And that has helped us. Our publisher, Self-Made Hero, began with making manga Shakespeares, and they are so good for helping teenagers understand a Shakespeare play on the page, because the text of the play is all there, but you've actually got some pictures to help you work out what's going on. So it's a great use of graphic novels.
Yeah.
If there's something I would like to change in Britain and North America, it's the assumption that a narrative told in pictures is always for children. Don't get me wrong, I love children's books. It's confusing for people to know whether these, sometimes people get a bit confused by our work and think it's like those children's Bibles, like an illustrated Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the Bible but for kids, and so they think that this is the Ragged Trouser Philanthropist but for children.
Yeah.
And it's not unsuitable, but it's not designed for children in mind. And I think that in other cultures, particularly in France, they completely are used to grown-ups reading full-length narratives told in pictures. And it's coming. It is happening. There's more and more of this kind of thing. And lots of original graphic novels for grown-ups. So we're getting there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see more acceptance of it in schools. I think it is more and more being used as a tool in schools. And
We hear so much from school librarians is that they can't get enough graphic novels, they can't keep them on the shelves. I mean, the phenomenal success of Heartstopper last year is a really good example of that. Alice Oseman is telling stories that our teenagers want to read, and she's telling them in a way they want to read them. And I think that there is a little hangover of, but it's not proper reading, they're not real books, but school librarians don't feel like that. What they have to do is persuade the people with the book budget that graphic novels are a good use of their money,
Yeah.
which they are.
Listen to your librarians, people. Read what they tell
Absolutely.
you.
I mean, that could be life advice, couldn't it? I
Absolutely,
think. Yeah,
yeah.
listen to librarians.
Yeah, I think also in Scotland in particular, although they've all just got in separate cars and decanted down to Thought Bubble this weekend, but there is such an amazing culture of graphic narrative, and I really get excited to see like our Scottish myths brought to life through them. And I just, and like Quindery Press, they are doing amazing work at the moment, and I just love to see queer representation. I love to see Scottish work out there and being celebrated and uplifted.
And I think the graphic novel format being so accepted by young people in particular is a really good opportunity for reviving things like what we're doing, but also for those kind of like, your myths and legends and stories that are really great if you can only access them.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way that doesn't make you feel like it's a slog as well.
No, I mean, reading for pleasure should be pleasurable.
Exactly, yeah.
It's fundamental.
Do we have another audience question? Or one online? Any from our online audience? Okay, I'm going to stare down anybody in the audience. I have some more questions that I can return to. Okay, we've only got a few more minutes, so you can have a wee think. I was going to ask as well, if you could speak to the suffragettes now, if you could speak to these women, the real women that they were, that your protagonists are based on, what would you say to them?
That is a really interesting question. So this is obviously the first event we've done for No Surrender because it only came out yesterday. So I'm so used to talking about the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, and I feel quite sure that if Robert Tressel saw this book, he would be furious.
Perfect.
Yeah, he would hate.
That's what we love to hear.
Because I don't think he would like two young women telling everybody what he meant. However, I think maybe that Constance Maud would feel differently about this. I think that I would be less embarrassed if I came face to face with Constance Maud.
She seems more chill.
She does seem more chill, but I think that she would be happy that the arguments and the story was getting another airing. I have such admiration for anybody who takes personal risks for the greater good in that way. And it's not something I personally would be brave enough to do. So I think that would be my main feeling, is if I was to meet a suffragette, is I would be quite in awe of the personal courage that it took to do what they did.
Yeah, absolutely. Take it out for tea and a cucumber sandwich.
Yeah, so they say that, the pen is mightier than the sword, and so I like to think that what Scarlett and I do is contributing to make the world a better place, but it is not in the same league as throwing soup on things.
Yeah, yeah. And it's all part of an ecosystem of civil disobedience.
Yes.
Yeah. Has anyone in the audience have a question? Okay. We've probably got time for one more question before we run out. And let me just see what I have here. So I guess maybe this is a downer to end on. There are some really, really difficult passages in this book. There are some scenes of quite horrible violence towards women who are completely powerless at the time that they're in prison. And I was wondering how you kind of went about making that kind of work, because that is obviously quite emotionally expensive to take on.
There are two sides to the violent parts in No Surrender. One side is a very sort of comics way of portraying violence that was endemic and normal. And I think it was important to show that putting up with a certain amount of being beaten up was a normal thing for women in those times. One of my favourite lines is someone who's been arrested referring to the police, knocking them about as though they were wed to us, as though being their husbands would give them the right, but as they're not married to them, they shouldn't be doing it, you know, and that, I thought that's quite powerful. But then there is obviously a scene where a woman goes through being force-fed, and it's in the book, in the detail, it's in the book for a reason. It is meant to be distressing and powerful and to make us really realise what it was, that the sacrifice that was being made so that we can now get to go to a polling station once every 4 years. And it struck me immediately when I read it that according to all legal definitions of rape, that a force feeding is a rape. And so I wrote the scene that way. When it came to drawing it, obviously you can see that Scarlett had some really imaginative ways of showing what was written in the original as quite a sort of psychedelic, trippy experience, because it was so overwhelmingly horrific to be that person. And so we've drawn it from Mary's point of view, and so her concept of the world is what we're looking at on the page, which is really hard to imagine, so you have to look at the book. But
It's amazing.
There's also some references to religion in there. Mary's a very religious person. She sees her activism as an article of faith, and there's at least one picture in there that is based on a Caravaggio of Jesus being crucified.
I love
those,
that one.
you know, so, and those things are very deep inside our brains. So, like talking about old masters makes it sound like I take comics too seriously, but what
Can
it's
never.
another cheat code, because those pictures are in there, they're familiar to us, and so when we see them, we're getting all of the associations for free
Yeah, it's
inside
like
that panel.
bold capital letters, martyrdom is
Yes,
happening.
yeah.
It's an astounding image, and a full page one as well, and it just is so expressive and beautiful to look at, as well as being absolutely horrendous. And that's, you know, one of those pages that I think really sticks out.
And I think that the sort of fairly, well, I was going to say modern art styles, but modern to them, that Scarlett used to describe the trauma. So we've got a bit of pointillism going on. There's references to Edward Munch in there. And so they're sort of the time as well. So like with the chapter headings are all based on commercial art from the era. It's all part of the absorption into their universe. It's all part of the world building, that the art matches the experience of those women, because we want the reader to feel like you're in there with them.
Yeah, and I really believe you achieve that, and I hope that everybody here will join Sophie for the signing just at the back table. And yeah, I hope you'll all join me in thanking Sophie so much for this brilliant chat. And congratulations to you and to Scarlett on No Surrender. It's brilliant.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and I'm really sorry that Scarlett's not here to talk to you as well.
Hopefully she's on the mend already.
I think she's feeling a bit better. Yeah.
Excellent news. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Sophie and to Heather for leading this wonderful chat. There's a signing table at the back. Come say hello and check out the books.